Okay, let's get going. We've got a really busy agenda this morning. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Absolutely delighted to be with you this morning. In some case, it's a late afternoon for some of our guests and perhaps some of our audience as well. So wherever you are in the world, you're very welcome to join us. My name is Anne-Marie Martin. I'm the Director of Membership for UK and International, and I also lead the trade programme at the British Chambers of Commerce. For your information, please note that this event is being recorded. It isn't Chatham House rule for that purpose. We will be showing the video later on on our various platforms. So this is our first Global Trade Month, which focuses, excuse me, on China. It's part of a series of events that takes place throughout the year. And each market has two parts. This is our second part. In fact, we're organizing this ahead of our first part. It's the first part will be later on in April. It's an in conversation with a leading expert about current affairs, future trade relationships. And for the China market, that will be with Deputy HM Trade Commissioner Tom Duke, and will take place at 9 a.m. on the 26th of April. If you haven't already registered for that, please don't worry. We will be sending you through registration details straight after this event. I think the aim of the series is to provide insights, advice, and answer as fully as possible some of the questions you might have about specific markets around the world. Before we go ahead, I really want to do this, is to thank our partner, WTA Group. Thank you so much. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to organize these events. And also a huge thanks to our colleagues at the British Chamber of Commerce in China. And we certainly couldn't have organized this without the team's support. So thank you. And Julian, if you could pass on our thanks to the team there in Beijing, I'd be grateful. So what we're going to try and tease out today is the importance around exporting our way out of a difficult economic time, overcoming some of the fears that we hear about from SMEs when it comes to embarking on or expanding their export journey, but particularly in respect of markets that are more far-flung like China. We want to talk a little bit more about and get into the nitty-gritty of why China is a desirable market. It is a strategic market for UK trade, with a huge population, 1.4 billion, growing middle class, need I say more, huge potential for business. We want to try and find out more about the UK's USPs in China, and also what are the first steps to success in entering a market like China, and what support is available for UK businesses. So before we get started, I'd just like to introduce you to our panel. We have Julian McCormack, who's country director for Rolls-Royce in China. But today, Julian is speaking at this event in his capacity as the chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in China. We also have Julian Fisher, who's co-founder of Venture Education, and he is vice chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in China. By the way, to be on the board of the chamber in China, you don't have to be called Julian. We always talk about this, how amazing it is that there are two of them. We have Adam Livermore, who is from Dezen, Shearer and Associates, and Claire Fargio, who is strategic financial advisor at WTA Group. So I'm going to kick off with Julian McCormack. Julian, the Chamber, and I know this well, I've seen a couple of iterations of this. You run a really successful and well-regarded sentiment survey. You've been doing that for several years now. Can you just sum up what the latest findings about the business environment in China are, please?
Yes, and hello everyone. I'm very happy to comment on the sentiment survey. So we in China, through the British Chamber, we run an annual sentiment survey, normally canvassing around about 300 responses from UK businesses operating here in China every year. We publish it every year in December, and that really provides a snapshot of business sentiment across different sectors in China. And it's fair to say that the results have been quite mixed over the past few years. Notably, of course, China's had 3 years of COVID. Can you hear me? Can I just check?
Yes, we can.
Great, good. So in terms of the snapshot, so if I was sitting here, the survey's published in December. If I was sitting here in December 2021, we would have been able to say that despite COVID restrictions, companies were broadly optimistic about the year ahead. That was in December 2021, but of course, no one really was prepared for the experiences that we had over the past year. And I think it's fair to say it really shook business. So I need to sort of make clear that the survey, given the timing of the survey, naturally is very, very focused on the challenges that businesses were facing. I'll say unusually in China, given the circumstances around COVID, but it really does highlight the extent to which business sentiment was shaken. It doesn't matter if we're talking about customers, if we're talking about revenues, we're talking about supply chains, we're talking about people, travel restrictions. 89% of companies said 2022 was more difficult. Business optimism was normally in the region of 50%, and that plummeted to 9%. And 42% of respondents said they were fully pessimistic about 2023. So we entered 2023 in a pretty poor position when it came to business sentiment. Our message as a result of that and the uncertainties in 2022, our 2023 message to the authorities here is all about stability. We've had such a prolonged period of uncertainty. China's reputation as a predictable environment for business really has dissipated. And so our focus for this to emphasize the importance of that stability. We do know policymakers are aware of the impact of zero COVID. That's very clear. They want 2023 to be a year of growth. We know we've seen growth targets to be set in the region of 5%. And there is a focus on rebuilding confidence in the market. It's a bit too early to say exactly what that means in practice. There is clearly more optimism now than there was in December. That's great. We welcome the changes. We welcome the fact we can travel. And we're seeing a lot of outreach from central and local governments to engage with business. Just today, I met with the Vice Mayor of Beijing, very keen to discuss and hear what government can do to enhance confidence in the business community. So it's mixed. Last year was bad. We need to be clear about that. I think we've got reasons to be optimistic in 2023, but there's still some way to.
Thank you so much. And actually, if I could bring Claire in now, because WTA Group has been in China for a long time. You've seen huge changes, huge opportunities. It would be good to hear from you what that experience was like, but also given Julian's remarks around the last year, clearly there will have been some impact. So tell us a little bit more about the journey, the experience, and what changes you've seen more recently, and what does that mean for the future? Thank you, Claire. You're on mute, Claire, sorry. Thank you.
I knew that would happen. Apologies, everyone. Yeah, so thank you, Anne-Marie. I think, first of all, it's important to say that WTA Group opened its first office in China in 2006. So really, we've been active there for quite some time now. And the rationale then was really to support our UK and US customers in their importing and exporting of goods in and out of China. And ever since that point, really, we've been customer-led. So we've expanded our offer to also support our business partners throughout the region via our bases in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. But really, I would say it's thanks to the highly skilled and loyal customer service that our team have delivered that we have on the ground in China that means that we've managed to build this up to a successful sort of regional operation. Today, really, we're continuing to extend that service, and they offer a very local facility on the ground. So quoting, booking, servicing the whole sort of management of the relationships as well for us there. And they've built some fantastically strong relationships with the shipping lines, particularly, so that we can ensure that we deliver a reliable and cost-effective service with real-time support, because it's not always that simple sometimes to get going in terms of freight importing and exporting in and out of China. There are some complexities that you need to sort of get quite familiar with. Yeah. So although we support lots of different sectors with their import and export strategies, we've probably got some depth of expertise that I can talk about that's probably quite unique to us. And that is, first of all, that we work extensively with the large publishing houses, particularly Dorling Kindersley and Penguin Random House, but also aerospace, transporting dangerous goods, and also the specialist food and drink sector. So if that's something of interest for me to dig a little deeper into, I'm quite happy to, because again, there are some sort of unique specialities I think that the China market offers that you won't find elsewhere, particularly for publishers. So for us, it's the glossy print that we really use China for, lots and lots of photography and specialist materials, particularly like children's board books that need to be, printed on that different material. We find it's only really possible to do that in China. They have a very, very high quality product and they can deliver it at a low cost. Also doing sort of top secret shipments, like the books that would accompany a Star Wars film launch, for example. We can use our China relationships to help effect that for our customers. But I think interestingly, and I know this is a theme that we're going to be touching on later, it's starting to be that center, that hub where you can also use the China market to touch on sustainability things. So this last year, we've helped Jolly Learning to print and distribute their phonics books to around 300,000 school pupils across Africa. And quite honestly, if it wasn't for China's unique positioning in the supply chain in this regard, with its high quality and low price offer, then we just wouldn't be able to do this. So it really does occupy quite a unique position, as I say, in the supply chain.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Julian F, if I could come to you. Bearing in mind what Claire's just said, so we talk about SMEs, and clearly SMEs is quite a broad spectrum. There's the S side of SMEs, the M, and sometimes quite large mid caps as well. But bearing in mind that probably a large proportion of our membership within the UK network are the S side of SMEs, what do you think are the opportunities for them specifically, especially as they're likely to be a little bit more nervous given their size and sort of access to resources as well? If you could tell us a little bit more about that, I'd be grateful.
So obviously it's so difficult to generalize about China because we are talking about an enormous country that represents about 17% of the world population. But I think we should be clear at the beginning that it is a very challenging market. It's 7,000 miles away from the UK, or kilometers away from the UK. It's culturally very different. The political system is different. It's hyper competitive. But, the reality is that it's the largest single market on earth. The UK is very well respected here. The economy is growing at 5% a year, which basically adds, a Holland into the global economy every single year. Success can be enormous, and China is the future. It is going to define a century, and it really is still a market for the future. But the realities are the streets aren't paved with gold here, and I definitely see a lot of organizations sort of imagining that they're going to come here, invest nothing, and make loads of money, and that really just isn't the case. I think my suggestion generally is one of two options: either kind of come in exceptionally light touch and try and get a foothold, and then really just take relatively random opportunities, just trying to understand the country a little better, or a more sustained entry strategy with a bit of investment and support along the way. But you are going to have to think about which one of those you're following. I think often people fall between those two chairs. There's sort of four things I'd say for small businesses. I run my own small business here and have for the last 10 years, so I definitely can speak from experience. I think there's probably four things that are going to help you early on. One is making sure to understand that you're going to need partnerships here, whether you want to or not. This is a country where partnerships are kind of essential. Your business model is probably going to be more important than your product or service, just because of the way that the market is here. We talk a lot about localization. Be increasingly careful with that word, because often it can mean basically recreating your entire business, which I would suggest is not really localizing, it's just starting another business for the China market. And then defensibility is something that is so essential here. This is the core, supply chain creating manufacturing market in the world. So if you can't defend what you do, then you will get swallowed up in China. Absolutely. So, in terms of USPs and in terms of where SMEs and can still thrive here, having international recognition and credibility is really important, because that's something that a lot of Chinese companies don't have. So you can definitely compete if what you do is kind of, provide something that is internationally recognized. And I think sort of associated with that, branding and history, obviously, that's something that can't be taken away. That's something very defensible. There's niche sectors that are in advance of where China is. Ultimately, China is pretty technologically advanced, and we shouldn't forget that. But there are still areas, especially niche areas in all sectors, where we have a lead in the UK. And then, what I say to people is you either need really advanced technology or you need advanced understanding. And what I mean by the latter is, I work a lot in the education sector out here. China can do education. When it comes to special educational needs or outdoor education or some of these niche areas, the UK is still advanced and still has something to offer and sell here.
That's great. Adam, I want to come on to you to talk a bit more about the business sort of regulatory framework. Julian's already spoken a little bit about, the cultural differences, the business cultural differences, in particular, the top tips around how one might set up a business or do business in China. Perhaps you can expand a little bit more on the sort of tax, legal, finance framework. Is it easy? Is it not to navigate, etc.? Please.
Yes, Anne-Marie. I think obviously the more complex your organization becomes in China, the more difficult China becomes to navigate. If you're just doing a simple operation here, maybe just some quality control or something like that, then it can be quite straightforward. Then if you're moving up to some kind of back office operation here, you'll need a larger headcount. You've got a larger presence here, it gets more complex in that way. Then if you're trading, product involved, more taxes, VAT involved, again, another level of complexity. Then we have e-commerce, retail, again, more complex. And finally, probably the most complex is manufacturing. So it really depends on what you're doing here. But as a general rule, if we look at those three kind of criteria that mentioned there, tax would be the first one. So simply explain, tax in China, corporate income tax is 25%, which I think is not high by global standards. And at the moment, there's various ways that companies can get preferential policies under certain circumstances to lower that rate. And now for small and medium enterprises, there can be an even lower rate, actually. This is policies introduced during COVID, which are still in place here. So it's not complex in that sense. It's relatively straightforward. VAT also, nothing particularly surprising there. I just mentioned exemptions. They can be achieved under certain circumstances, depending on what you're doing here. But if you're doing trading, then you also need to consider transfer pricing. Obviously, the Chinese Tax Bureau is interested to get its pound of flesh. They want you to make some profit here, and they're keen that you don't move all the profit offshore. So if you're actually bringing products in here and selling them to related parties, especially. And for manufacturing enterprises where you've got different ways of calculating cost of goods sold, that's a specific thing that they have to consider here, and that's a very complicated topic. But if you're going to do manufacturing here, then yes, there are some things to consider, but it's not drastically different. If we look from the legal perspective, I think probably the most relevant one for most foreign organizations here is labor law. It's quite strict in China. It's not easy to terminate people. So that really has to be considered before you actually start your hiring process and build up here. You could say there's a lot of hidden costs involved in terminating people here compared with most other countries. So we don't have time to go into specifics, but that's certainly something to put at the forefront of your thoughts there. IP, especially if you're looking to sell here, or you have a product, you're trading, something like that, or doing anything related to retail, you want to protect your intellectual property before you come to China, before you start to set up or do anything. A lot of people make that mistake. And And the other one, PI, personal information, basically. Data security and personal information protection here in China now is very strict. If you're doing anything, again, relating to retail or anything collecting the data on Chinese citizens, then you can fall foul of these PIPL laws, which are similar to GDPR in Europe, but not exactly the same. And it's relevant even if you have employees only here in China, you still have to follow these rules. They're becoming very strict recently. So I think on the legal side, these three topics are the main ones. Of course, if you have suppliers and customers, you'll have to deal with them under Chinese commercial rules. So make sure they're in place as well. Finally, on the finance side, China has capital controls. So bringing in money is a challenge, as is taking out money if you make profit here. So this needs to be well planned. It's you need to put in a relevant amount of registered capital, not too low, not too high. And then if you need to put loans in as well, they're restricted to. So this really needs to be thought about and planned in advance rather than finding out too late that you've got no cash flow. And then one issue here in China is around what we call fapiaos, invoices, which are now rapidly transforming into e-invoices. Everything's going digital over here in China, probably faster than most markets. And that also needs companies to technologically keep up with everything. So yeah, I think those are the main things I can think of on the regulatory side.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Could you just expand a little bit more around sort of managing people? You talked about some of the rules around that in terms of HR rules, but what would you say are the big, what are the advantages of having local hires? What are the differences around that as well?
Well, you'll need local hires in China if you're operating in China for sure. And I wouldn't say it's any more complex anywhere else in the world, but when you look to hire people, of course, you have to judge whether you're in a position to know whether that person's suitable for the role or not. So on the commercial side of anyone's business, they can probably tell if someone's an expert in that or not. But when it comes to maybe the financial side or the legal side, if you don't know how to judge if someone's telling you the truth or if they really know what they're doing in this area, it may be better to outsource those functions. So there's lots of companies like ourselves that are providing those kind of things. That's a typical mistake that many companies make, is hire internally, hire the wrong person, and then suffer the consequences and the reverse course later on. In terms of the regulatory side, because of these rules in China relating to difficulty of terminating people, one tip I generally give to our clients is relating to the length of the contract they offer to their employees. We generally suggest it to our clients, and in fact we use ourselves a system where we give our employees 3 years fixed term contracts with a 6-month probation period. So what that does is it gives us the flexibility to judge within 6 months whether the employee is suitable for the role that we hired him or her for. And then if they're obviously suitable within 3 months, for instance, we simply shorten or eliminate that requirement for that person. And by that stage, we know that they'll be good. And then we've got the next 2.5 years. And then at the 3-year stage as well, there's an opportunity to terminate the employee if you need to, even for a business reason, with minimal compensation, a month for every year they've served, basically. But outside of those windows, it is difficult to terminate employees in China, especially once they've got a non-fixed term contract. So this is something that companies should plan for in advance, especially if your headcount is going to be a high one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to turn to sort of consumer trends now, if we can. Julian M., I think we've already mentioned, I think it was you that mentioned that the British brand is highly regarded in China. It could have been Julian F., but anyway, could you expand a little bit more around what product services Chinese consumers are particularly keen to buy, particularly now that the economy is opening up? What does the future of consumers look like, and what are they likely to want from British suppliers?
So, and others may also want to comment on this. So from the Chamber's perspective, I mean, the first point is that for China in 2023, consumption is one of the biggest priorities. It is, we met with the Ministry of Commerce yesterday, it is the year of consumption, as was branded by China. So we're going to see measures and incentives in order to boost consumption. 3 years of COVID means that there is significant household savings, but the government needs to stimulate confidence in order to for consumers to be willing to spend. So, and as Julian Fisher said, the Chinese economy is set to grow by around about 5% this year. We can say that with confidence, and also then we can see that incentives are in the pipeline. In the first few months of this year, we've seen, of course, travel, hospitality, food and drink, all of these consumable services have really done well since China's reopening. But we have seen that there is limited, or there are headwinds when it comes to, especially to large ticket purchases. We've seen trade figures for the first few months. They're not, we're not seeing as big a rebound as we might have, but that's one reason why the government is focusing on it so much. Potential, and we need to emphasize that potential remains significant. We know that there are policies coming forward to stimulate automotive consumption and to stimulate consumption in household goods, incentivizing household spending. We know that's on the horizon. But when we look at the sentiment survey, there's clearly a lot of scope for measures that would reduce barriers, that would make a difference for companies, for British UK companies that are in the market here today. We know that there is a lot of potential within different sectors, healthcare, be it creative industries, be it advanced manufacturing and transportation, be it the built environment, energy, retail and consumer goods. So there are a lot of areas where we know that with the right measures, then the government would be able to incentivize and unlock opportunities for British companies here, who are in some areas, reporting that there are barriers hindering their business development here in China. So on that, we have to also think of the opposite. We've seen, and this is where we have to emphasize that in some sectors there is regulatory risk. We've seen that in education, we've seen it in technology platforms. So even though we can think of sectors where there's going to be significant demand based on everything we know about China, we need to be conscious and take into account the potential for regulation to impede the market. We've had instances where sectors and members within the Chamber of Commerce have been very significantly affected by short or unexpected changes in policy. Final point around this, and that's around China's commitments to peak carbon by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So we know that we're going to see a massive shift towards a lower carbon solutions, energy, manufacturing. So we can see that services and capability to support that energy transition in China will be in huge demand. It's an emerging area. We know that policy is developing. It's an area to watch. And I guess my final point is to, with all of this, we know that markets and sectors are changing. We need to understand how opportunities are developing. And I would encourage anyone online to download our annual position paper, which provides a really deep assessment of the business environment in individual sectors, and that will maybe some of the opportunities and challenges that companies face in each sector. So I would encourage people to take a look at that. That's on our BritCham China website.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Julian. And that actually brings me very neatly back to Claire, because you mentioned it earlier, ESGs. Clearly, there's an increasing demand. Some of these are met in terms of supply chains to a greater and lesser extent. Can you provide some insight in how this works in terms of your own business, actually, and how that works on the ground, which would be really helpful. But generally speaking as well, sort of in terms of manufacturing in the Chinese market, and what would be expected of UK companies in terms of if they're pitching as part of these supply chains, what is expected of them? Thank you, Claire.
Sure, I'll do my best. Thank you. Obviously, we're not manufacturing anything ourselves, but we are moving the manufactured goods.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
exactly.
So I think we need a little bit of context here, because it's all well and good having these fantastic ambitions, proposals, targets, but for an awful lot of countries, and it's not just China, these really are just that. They are proposals and commitment statements of intent. And actually the difficult bit is working out how you're actually going to get there and making sure that you deliver on those plans. So a little bit first of all. So the idea really came about in sort of ESG. The idea of that in China really only appeared as a topic of conversation about 10 years ago. And it was really part of the sustainable China development model. Large banks, regulators, and obviously subsidiaries of multinationals were conducting business in China. And they've always been, showing an interest in ESG supply chain compliance. That's sort of, the given. But let's just remember for a moment that the effort involved in actually meeting these ESG requirements within global supply chains. What we're talking about here from a big UK company perspective is an approach that really accounts for the entire footprint of a manufacturer's or supplier's operations. And what that really means is taking a deep dive into the supply chains to understand, where source materials have come from, how the people are handling those source materials, how they within the supply chain, what resources have been expended in order to produce the products, how much tax has been paid to the local governments and so on. And, now more importantly, what's been or what is likely to be the climate impact of that product as it makes its journey around the globe to your eventual processing sites or to your points of sale. That just isn't an easy thing to achieve. It takes a lot of hard work to generate the right and reliable data that you need for that sort of whole process to work. And it also and transparency that doesn't really exist in China as yet. It's obviously coming, it's starting to be developed, but as Julian M has already mentioned, there is a lack of local capability. And also I think there is a little bit of a lack of understanding, and much more investment is needed in order to bring that into the status that's needed in order to affect this easily. But from the China perspective, I think there are issues with China and its own ESG, but it's not just China alone. It exists in many other countries and economies, like pollution, like the standards of health and safety and the concerns around that, like a lack of natural resources. So a lot of things have to be imported just to even start the process of manufacturing something, as well as standards of conducting business. So corruption and bribery, for example, it's things that businesses are aware of and there are concerns about from an external perspective of in China. So at the moment, my sense is, and I'd be interested to hear other panelists' views on this, is actually that governance is becoming much more the thing that business effectors, business leaders are actually getting concerned about, and having ethics and standards in place is becoming much more required, whereas it wasn't before. So coupled with the environmental impacts, I think there's also a how we conduct ourselves in business ethics sort of discussion point that's very much of the moment. I've mentioned the shortage of skills, and then I think really to talk about the logistics perspective just for a moment, so where we're at within the industry, I'm not denying the fact that the logistics industry has been slow. It is like a tanker itself. It's not making progress very rapidly, and some of the technological solutions just haven't been developed yet. That really is the sort of the state of effects, really. Things are creeping forward. There is legislation around decarbonisation, obviously. We've got sustainable aviation fuel, but that only really accounts for 1% of flights globally at the moment. And any flight that says it is using SAF, it's only ever 50-50 because they can't really use 100% these new technologically driven fuels yet, because the biofuels yet, because they actually erode things like the seals on the fuel caps of the aircraft, so they can't be used. It would just leak out when they're in flight. all the marine heavy shipping is still using fossil fuels. Again, there are targets in place around that, but it's very slow. You're looking at 5% reduction by 2030, for example. And then I think road and so on, the electric vehicles for heavy trucks, we're looking at the earliest. I think we've got prototypes from Volvo and so on that are coming on the market that are meant to be efficient and sensible. We're looking at 2030, 2035 at the absolute earliest. And green shipping lanes do exist, but even though we're offering them to customers, there is such a price differential that it really is prohibitive. So, in a nutshell, there is a massive amount of investment needed on all fronts to actually turn this around and deliver what we need to do if we want the climate to survive in a sensible shape in the long term.
Absolutely, Claire. Thank you so much. Julie and Emma, I am going to come back to you, though, to expand a little bit on particularly your findings and the Chamber's position around this whole area, around how you conduct business, ethics, those compliance issues, the various points that Claire's just made. Is that impeding FDI into China or trade? What more could be being done, shall we say, at the China end around this?
I'm not aware, and certainly it hasn't come up as anything other than something that companies are increasingly mindful of. Sustainability in its broadest context, sustainability of supply chains, sustainability of operations, energy efficiency, all of those elements. We ask questions around that. We ask companies, businesses here, to what extent do they have their own ESG plans in place? We think that amongst our membership, there is more to be done within the British community. So we think that in contrast to where we thought our membership would be, there is still quite a large proportion of companies that haven't really put in place what we would call fully mature sort of ESG processes and standards. So there's room for that. Is it something that is a priority? Increasingly, yes. And when we ask companies, it is obviously sector specific. When you look at manufacturing, very much people are looking at how can you ensure that you have standards in your supply chain, as was just discussed now by Claire. Do you have access to renewable power? All of these questions are starting to come in. But when we ask broadly about opportunity, most of our memberships see this as an opportunity. So it's not considered to be a risk or a challenge. It's broadly considered to be an area where actually it's an area where companies feel that they have a contribution to make, where China is changing very rapidly. And therefore the demand for services and expertise in this area is only going to increase. So it comes out in our service responses as one of the opportunities for the future in China.
Brilliant. And
I should just make a quick note on that as
well.
Yes,
I was going to ask you, Julian,
on the governance side.
Yeah.
We have partnered with the IOD in the UK, and we are going to be delivering some courses on good governance and kind of being an effective board member. So it's definitely something that we're looking to do as a chamber out here as well and encourage.
Oh, brilliant. Interesting to know. We're developing something similar at the BCC as well. So let's discuss. Not that it's a competition, but just saying. But Julian, I was going to bring you in because you were nodding. So it would be good to hear from your perspective a little bit more around that as well, because it's hugely important. It is. And Adam, I'd like to hear from you about this as well. So Julian, go ahead, please.
Yeah, honestly, I think it's less important for smaller businesses out here. It's always a bit of a challenge. Compliance just with the rules and regulations that Adam laid out, I think is complicated enough. And then obviously when you put on top of that all of these other kind of global commitments, so I definitely think for smaller organizations it's harder. And as Claire mentioned, it's also can cost a lot of money that maybe small businesses don't have to be kind of considering. So yeah, definitely from an SME perspective, maybe less of a concern. But the flip side of that, opportunities for providers of green products, green services, and we definitely see that a lot more in our membership now, that a lot of the services that they're offering around best practice and compliance and, and sort of bringing in kind of models from the UK and looking to see how they can develop in China.
So huge opportunity for British businesses to transfer that knowledge and expertise into China, into the market.
Huge opportunity, and obviously we could talk about this all day. I think always the challenge with that area is around how do you build a sustainable business here?
Yes.
Because you know, with things like best practice, you know, it's great, but do you deliver a one-off training? Do you have some kind of certification? And if so, how do you endorse that? And how do you make sure that you have repeat business? So there's huge opportunities here. And it really comes back to what I said earlier, which is you really, really need to think about the business model. How do you build something that from the beginning is defensible and sustainable in financially long into the future, and not just a one-off transference of knowledge and then you disappear and everything kind of gets done by a Chinese company with all your materials?
Yeah, absolutely. Adam, any thoughts from you? You have a lot of experience with India as well, and there's always been this kind of India versus China when it comes to things like manufacturing. Maybe in that context, you could tell us a little bit more about your perspective on that particular area.
Yeah, well, I was listening to that conversation there, and I think first of all in China, and I imagine, yeah, the same would be true in India. The challenge for companies, I think, is not so much the regulatory environment in those countries. It comes from their own supply chains and into their actual supply chains. Our typical clients are maybe not companies that you would have heard of, but they're supplying to companies that everybody would know. And those companies are forcing these ESG requirements on them. But they don't know how to do that in places in China and India, so they have to be compliant. So this is the opportunity for organizations like us. So there is pressure on these organizations to be more compliant, but it's not so much coming from the government itself, it's coming from their own customers. But to compare India and China there, I think especially from a manufacturing perspective, as you were mentioning, Anne-Marie, yeah, the Desinshire and Associates who I'm working for, we're basically helping foreign direct investment into these countries. And of course, China's 20 or 30 years ahead of India. So unsurprisingly, in our organization, we've got 200 and something people in China and only about 20 people in India. And I'm actually responsible for both of them. So you can say that it's very mature in China. There's a template here, there's the supply chain in place, there's the infrastructure in place. It's all very organized, and there's a methodology to follow. So companies that are going to India to do something similar, they've got a lot less of a template, can I say, to actually follow. There's an awful lot of challenges to doing it. So I would say it's definitely more difficult at the current stage. I don't see India replacing China in terms of complex manufacturing. Maybe basic manufacturing can be done, but I think a good strategy for companies looking at these markets is maybe to go into India as a supplement or a bonus rather than put all their eggs in the India basket. It will take a long time. I think we see Apple, for instance, they're over-reliant on China. They want to reduce their over-reliance on China, and they see India as the only viable market because they're so enormous. It's going to take them a long, long time to do that because the supply chain is sophisticated. The product itself is difficult. They've got all sorts of challenges. And I think that will be the same for any company, actually. One thing I would suggest is if you do want to do any kind of manufacturing anywhere, first of all, go into that country and do something simpler, like quality control, like trading, get a good understanding with people on the ground there first, and then try to do something more ambitious. So if you're in China, but you're not in India, and you're thinking of going to India, don't go there and suddenly manufacture. Get your footprint in place first and understand the basics. Walk before you run, basically.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam. The other Anne-Marie is reminding me that I'm almost up for time and we need to move to Q&A, but I do have a couple of other things I do want to ask you, Julian and Claire as well. But just for the audience, don't forget there is the Q&A chat function, Q&A function. Please do add some questions in there, otherwise I'm going to have to think of a few. So please spare me, which would be super. I want to focus a little bit on sectors. We've talked about this throughout the conversation. I've been hearing huge amounts being said and presented around, for example, the Greater Bay Area. Lots of opportunities, huge strategic predominantly infrastructure projects around the world, in China, in this case. I'd like to explore, Julian F., a little bit more around what are the opportunities for suppliers of goods and services into that particular project. You don't have to be hugely specific because, you know, I understand that perhaps you don't have the, you know, the inside knowledge there, but a little bit more about what the UK can bring to the table in those kinds of projects, using that as an example.
But we do actually ask in our sentiment survey, and 47% of our respondents said that part of their growth in 2022 was the Greater Bay Area. So that definitely is an area where you've seen British businesses are seeing growth. You know, one thing I think that we have to be cautious of with China, you know, I think increasingly that's true nowadays, less so than it was 30 years ago, is about this idea that the government will stimulate an area. Do you enter early and look to get an advantage, or is that a risk that that area never really develops? And I think right now a lot of people are talking about Hainan. There's definitely a lot of incentives from the government to go and set up there and to start doing things there. I was down there 3 weeks ago. You know, you can speak with government. There's an open door. They talk about a free trade port. They'll all tell you that it's going to be the new Shanghai. You know, is that sensible? Are you going to get ahead of the curve by going there, or essentially could you invest and then, you know, all the infrastructure actually didn't lead to people moving there and all the other things that you need to kind of develop a business and a market. So I think one thing every year in the sentiment survey that we see is that we ask people, are you investing more in China? And of those people that we ask, always the highest percentage will say their reason for investment, I think this year was 84%, are saying that we are investing more in China for market potential. And again, that is a number we need to be careful about, because if that number remains the same, that potential does need to be met at some point. You know, you can't just continually invest into the country if you're not seeing profit and you're not able to take that profit back home. So yes, I think there are opportunities in the Greater Bay Area, and I think there are opportunities in Hainan and certain other areas too. But I think I do encourage companies to look at whether they can earn a profit relatively quickly here. Otherwise, you know, it can be a bit of a quagmire. I mean, in terms of sectors, we've talked on green growth, and, you know, I think that's definitely an area, but let's not remember that China's not standing still. I have heard a lot recently about kind of green tech companies coming here and essentially sitting in a room and realizing they're trying to sell to the Chinese side, and the Chinese side are trying to sell the same stuff back to them. So I think just being aware that China is also investing heavily in that area. R&D and innovation, I think 48% of our companies said that the reason that they were successful in China was because they were innovative and that their technology was ahead of the curve. Health, well-being, outdoor, you know, camping is enormous at the moment, and that's an area where I think quality really matters. And so yeah, especially with health, you know, the Chinese are very, very skeptical and want to make sure that products are high quality and internationally kind of, you know, international standards. I think having a product with a good story, a really good narrative, is going to matter for a lot of small businesses out here, but nothing is going to happen organically. If you're a cheese producer in Dorset, the idea you're going to start selling to China and everyone's just going to love your cheese and you're going to become a billionaire, I think you need to be really, really careful. There are real success stories here, but it always comes with hard work, good local partnerships, a lot of hustle, quite a lot of luck. You know, it's, you know, one city here is as different from another city as maybe 2 European countries. And then finally, obviously, the education sector has had challenges, but I think there's still opportunities there, and you should speak to me about that if you're interested.
Well done. Right at the last minute. Claire, do you want to expand? Because obviously you have clients in various sectors. It would be great to hear from you, your thoughts around that.
Yes, sorry, apologies. My camera keeps flickering this morning. There must be the high winds or something. Yeah, so obviously we're helping predominantly small and medium-sized businesses with their supply chains and importing and exporting from China. And we've seen some quite sort of different trends. So, you know, I know where the promised land is meant to be, but where our customers are growing their own particular products and service lines, it's really in things like the specialist goods of food and drink. So meatless foods, vegetarian foods, that's become a strong growth area for us. And that will be UK producers taking their goods to China, and then we're returning our containers with actually very different types of goods on board. It's more plant and machinery, kit and so on that's going to be assembled in the UK and then sold onto the global market. So, you know, at the moment there's a real disparity between goods that are going out to China and what we're bringing back. And, you know, a lot of that has, our trade has changed with obviously changing consumers' tastes. And so I can see that there is this big opportunity now for UK brands, in particular, specialist high-end brands, to tap into that growing, more affluent, middle-class sort of section of society, particularly in and around the Greater Bay Area, where there is this sort of growing population of wealthy individuals that are looking to spend some of that money that the government is trying to encourage them to do so. As I say, it's a bit more niche for us, I'm afraid, rather than being something as broad brush.
Thank you, Claire. There's a question for you actually in the Q&A. Thank you, Paul, for your questions. I'm grateful. Something, I don't know whether you've seen it, but around container rates and how they're likely to evolve in the next 12 months. You've seen it. So if you, any thoughts around that?
Indeed, in fact, actually, just for everyone's sort of understanding, it might be worthwhile just having a little dip into what happened with container rates during COVID, because it really was quite dramatic. So basically, the supply chain issue reared its head in COVID, didn't it? When things went into lockdown, you had, let's just generalize, Western economies really stockpiling, importers stockpiling, panic buying, and there were goods stuck in containers in ports, ships unable to get out or ships unable to dock. There was a shortage of containers, nothing was moving. The prices for container rates went up tenfold. Yes. And they were moving so quickly that, quite honestly, WTA Group, we felt like a bank at times. We were financing those goods for the length of time that the ships were stuck, either unable to dock or on the weeks, months that it took them to get back to the UK. And we weren't receiving any money until, you know, they'd actually landed on UK shores. So and we're not alone. It was the same for everybody. So people feel that, you know, the prices skyrocketed, things are out of control. And now there's this general perception that things have hit rock bottom again, but in fact they haven't. They've just gone back to pre-COVID levels. So for me, it's a sort of a normalized, you know, operating pricing structure that we've got at the moment. And I can't really see that that's going to move very much over the next 12 months, to be perfectly honest, Paul, answering your question. So I agree, it is back to pre-COVID levels, but I can't see what's going to really make that move very much now. I can see that we're still playing catch up with the amount of trade. We, you know, everything feels very busy and eager to get going again, but it hasn't really brought down the shipping container rate. So I can imagine that we're going to stay in and around this level for the next 12 months or so. I don't really think that it's going to be moving anywhere very fast. No,
thank you, Claire. And Julian M, if you, hopefully you can answer this one, Paul's question around the propagating inward policy. How does this relate to the year of consumption, etc.? Are you happy to answer that one?
Yeah, I'm very happy to provide some perspective on that. I think, first of all, you know, there are conflicting or potentially what can be seen as contradictory messages when we look at what China is saying. If you look at the messages that come out of the 20th Party Congress and most recently the two sessions here, there is a lot of focus on security. There's a lot of focus on energy security, on food security, on supply chain security, or security of supply. And so there are areas where very clearly there are policy drivers to try and ensure that there is resilience in China to shore up against concerns. And it's particularly relevant when it comes to the transfer of goods into and out of China. So by security, what China's looking for is resilience. And then there is a question, does that mean that the policy is for something to be made by China or made in China? And there is a difference. So the understanding is predominantly is when we look at security and we look at China being inward, it doesn't necessarily mean the policy is to be made by China. It's much more about encouraging, in order to reduce concerns against that perceived risk, encouraging the products for the local market to be made locally, and that's predominantly what is behind that. But at the same time, China is, and almost at the next sentence will be saying, but we are opening up. We are opening up to more trade, more investment. We are reducing restrictions on the import list or investment lists. So therefore, there's almost a contradictory environment. But what that means is that China is looking to retain access to talent, to knowledge, to capability, to technology. That's what China wants. Yes, there is concerns over security, but at the same time, there is a desire to remain open to areas where China knows capability is wanted and needed. And so that's the sort of the policy. So China is becoming inward-looking in certain areas, but equally is at the same time saying we are very much open. And I think that's going to continue for quite a long period of time. And that's what is meant by the dual circulation strategy. So we've got this almost contradictory messages, but they're slightly different in that sense. And when it comes to consumption, I don't see a huge, if we're talking about consumer goods, then I don't see that is within scope in terms of concerns about localization by China. I think Chinese consumers, they want the best products. I think the demand for quality, we see that that hasn't changed. Chinese consumers are extremely demanding in what they want and what they look for. We know that when there is the right product, people will travel when they're able to travel. They will travel the world to go and buy those products. So having that available in China is not, that demand is not going to go away, will be my take.
Thank you so much, Julian. Adam, just we've talked about culture, but maybe just a final comment around that, because culture, it's about people at the end of the day. So just a final comment from you, please, on that.
Specific to China, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think the Chinese people are pretty optimistic about their future here. I don't think they're getting more insular in that sense. They expect China to continue to grow. They see their lives getting better and better still. They know about the threats going forward. Their population is starting to decline now, whereas other countries are, India in particular is increasing. But I think they just keep this positive mindset, and I don't see that changing for the next number of years. I think that a lot of people are feeling more and more affluent. COVID was obviously a big shock for everybody, and there was some skepticism about whether the government went the right direction and how they dealt with it, but it feels over now here in China, and it's back to normal, back to work as normal for most of the population, and I think they're relieved about that, and optimistic for the future here. So I think that should provide good opportunities for foreign invested companies to come here, especially those in, for instance, consumer goods or anything that benefits from that kind of positive mindset, really.
Thank you very much, Adam. And my final question, my apologies to our anonymous question. We're not going to have time to cover it, but because I just want one final question to Julian F. What can the BritCham in China do to support companies? And maybe that will cover a little bit of the question from our anonymous attendee.
So we should definitely highlight that we were the International British Chamber of the Year in 2022. So I definitely think we do a good job. We support organizations in market. So if you are a British company that comes into China in any way, please do join the British Chamber. We have 3 key pillars. That is community, knowledge, and advocacy. Community obviously is the social events we do and the networking. Knowledge is giving you the insights that you need to improve your business and grow your business here. And then the advocacy piece is, I think, especially big and important for bigger companies, because we regularly meet with government and talk to them about some of the challenges that British businesses are facing here and try to resolve them. So please do join the British Chamber of Commerce in China if you do business here. and we'll do everything we can to support you.
Thank you so much, Julian. And we are exactly on time. Thank you all so much. Hopefully the audience found that as interesting as I did and we did. I really appreciate your expertise and your time this morning. Thank you so much. See you all again in the next session, which is in April, as I mentioned. And then we also will be focusing on the UAE, just so you know, in June. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day, good evening, good night. Bye-bye.